Before we descend into the strange twilight of the 6th century, take a moment to breathe. If you enjoy calming historical journeys that drift into the surreal, consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. We explore forgotten eras, one whispered tale at a time. Now, dim the lights, let the quiet settle, and imagine yourself waking up in the year 536. You are a peasant, a merchant, a scribe, or perhaps a monk tasked with copying scriptures in the flickering glow of oil lamps. The world around you is simple, rhythmic. The seasons come and go. The sun rises predictably, bringing with it warmth, life, and a sense of certainty, until one day it doesn't. At first, the change is almost imperceptible. The mornings are unusually dim. Shadows seem to retreat. The warmth of the sun grows timid. Birds, those reliable messengers of seasonal change, seem confused. You step outside and notice your breath in the air, even though it shouldn't be that cold. Still, it's probably just a strange week. Weather has always been odd. That's what you tell yourself. But the days don't get brighter. The sun, that golden anchor in the sky, remains faint, shrouded, like a coin behind a veil. It casts no shadows. The air feels dry, yet heavy. In Constantinople, people murmur about an ominous dry fog that won't lift. In China, strange stars are seen during the day, and in places like Ireland and Syria, annals begin to fill with cryptic observations. Failure of bread, the sun as pale as the moon, no warmth, no season. The change isn't just local, it's global. The sky has dimmed across continents. What was once a source of daily complaint, too hot again, too bright, is now a terrifying absence. The light is there, but it's weak, scattered, diffused, like an eternal dusk. The Roman historian Procopius, known for chronicling wars, breaks his usual stoic tone to say that the sun gave light without brightness. His words aren't flowery metaphors, they're panic in writing. He, like many others, had no explanation. This isn't just bad weather, it's something else. Something that doesn't pass. Something that doesn't care whether you're rich, poor, devout, or cursed. It lingers like a ghost with no name. In a world without modern science, without satellite images or climate charts, the mind fills in the blanks with fear. Has God turned away? Has the sky broken? Is this punishment, a prophecy, or the end? You pray, you wait, but the sun continues to stumble weakly across the sky, refusing to explain itself. And somewhere deep in your bones, you feel the first tug of dread. Because this isn't just a strange season. This is the year 536, and it's only just beginning. The days roll on, but they feel more like prolonged nights. Villagers rub their eyes and step outside expecting sunrise, only to find a sky that's dimmer than twilight. A cold wind drifts through your home, and for the first time in memory, there's frost on the ground when there shouldn't be. Livestock grow anxious, confused by the lack of daylight. Birds circle without direction. Crops hesitate to grow. And across your village, every conversation starts with a glance upward and a question no one can answer. In places like Constantinople, astronomers gather with scrolls and ink-stained fingers, desperately searching ancient texts for omens, eclipses, or divine warnings. Chinese court scribes report seeing stars at midday, not figuratively, but literally. Constellations typically reserved for cold, winter nights are now visible while planting rice. Something in the heavens has shifted, but the heavens are not speaking. Even the sun, once the centerpiece of worship and timekeeping, seems to have abandoned its post. No longer warm, it drifts overhead like a ghost lantern, offering no guidance. The priest in your village calls for mass fasting and prayer, claiming the Lord is testing mankind. Meanwhile, an old herbalist whispers of dragons swallowing the light, but religion offers no warmth. Science hasn't been invented yet, and the sun, the most dependable thing in your world, continues to look pale, cold, and distant, like it's watching you, but has already decided to leave. Food becomes a quiet obsession, not hunger yet, but the fear of it. Barley sprouts in strange patterns. The wheat seems reluctant. Grapes hang, small and green, refusing to ripen. You hear rumors from the next town over that their fields are failing too. There's talk of hoarding. Prices inch upward in the market square. What's more unsettling than famine is uncertainty. People don't know if they should plant again. The seasons have lost their cues. Calendars feel meaningless. Time itself feels unanchored, like the world is out of rhythm. And then it gets colder. Not a chill, not a breeze, a drop. Days that should be warm turn bitter. You shiver during what should be summer. A neighbor mentions wrapping their children in blankets in July. Your bones ache. You think it's age, but so do the children. The sky gives no hint of when this will end. Word spreads of illness, not the plague, not yet, but coughs that linger, fevers that don't break. People weaken. They blame bad spirits, cursed soil, the wandering fog. But the fog doesn't answer. You ask your priest, how long will this last? He doesn't know. You ask the elder, the merchant, the traveler. No one knows. All you know is this: the sun has grown quiet, and when the sun is silent, the whole world holds its breath. Some days feel like a loop. You wake, dress, squint at the gray haze, and wonder if you're still in yesterday. The difference between morning and evening has become a cruel joke. No vibrant dawn, no golden sunset, just an endless ash-colored dome hanging low over your village, refusing to leave. The village sundial is abandoned. Children walk past it with puzzled expressions, not because they don't understand it, but because it no longer works. It casts no shadow. The hour of the day is a mystery, and the sense of routine has quietly begun to dissolve. Time is untrustworthy now. The fog, or whatever this heavy presence in the air is, won't lift. It doesn't behave like mist. It doesn't move with the breeze. It doesn't smell like smoke. It just lingers, thick, cold, and dead. You've never seen anything like it. No one has. It doesn't belong. And yet, it's everywhere. In cities like Constantinople, people describe the sun as blue, as if some invisible curtain is muting its light, transforming gold into bruised steel. Over in China, scrolls speak of yellow dust falling from the sky. That's not just strange, it's terrifying. Dust isn't supposed to fall like snow in summer. In Ireland, monks scrawl the same grim phrase over and over again in their quiet abbeys: failure of bread. Not a metaphor, not poetic language, literal starvation. And then, one morning, someone says it snowed. Not in winter, not in December. It snowed in August, in Mesopotamia. The villagers, already cold and confused, look at each other like they've been cursed. Birds vanish, trees stall, insects disappear. Even nature seems disoriented. The bees don't return. The flowers close early. Your sheep stand still longer than usual, staring into the distance like they know something you don't. You stop measuring days by the calendar. Instead, you count how many good eggs your hens lay, how many of your turnips make it past the sprouting phase. How many neighbors fall ill? These become your new units of time, and still no explanation. Rumors swirl. Some say a mountain exploded in the east. Others speak of heavenly punishment. Most just shake their heads and pray louder. At night, you stare at the sky, not for answers, but for signs. Anything. But there are no stars, just that dim, choking layer of nothing that's taken the heavens hostage. The moon glows weakly behind it, like a candle behind a wall of ash. You remember what warmth felt like. You remember sunlight, soft breezes, harvest smells, and you wonder if those were dreams. Because now you're wrapped in a year that won't let go. A sky that forgot how to change. A world suspended between winter and something worse. And all you can do is endure it. By now you've stopped pretending this is just an odd year. This isn't a bad season. It's a different world. The signs are everywhere, and perhaps most clearly in the fields. Where once golden stalks swayed in the wind, now the soil lies stubborn and bare. Seeds planted with care hesitate to grow. Those that sprout look weak, pale, confused, as if even they are unsure whether they belong here. The barley is thin. The grapes hang like sour pebbles on reluctant vines. Wheat, it barely tries. Your neighbors begin trading for grain, but there's less of it. The markets are tense. Coins are worthless when bread is scarce. A sack of moldy flour becomes a luxury. Farmers, the backbone of the land, look hollow-eyed and beaten. Not by war, not by plague, but by the ground itself, refusing to cooperate. They till the earth with the quiet dread of someone digging a grave, hoping something, anything, will grow. And then there's the hunger. It starts in whispers. A child who didn't eat enough, a neighbor who faints during prayer. You hear it in the silence of dinner tables, in the thin soups, the skipped meals. It gnaws at the edges of your community, creeping in slowly. No feast days, no spare bread. Every bite feels like a countdown. In the monasteries, even the monks are worried. Their cellars, once full of salted fish and barley stores, are dwindling. One speaks of the sky as a punishment. Another suggests sorcery. A third simply sits in silence, watching the gray horizon. People begin to barter more than goods. They trade stories, tales of lands to the south, where the sun still shines, rumors of valleys untouched by the cold. No one really believes them, but belief isn't what matters now. Hope is scarce, and even lies provide warmth. You see changes in people. Children stop playing. Elders stop talking. Even the church bell rings softer, as if ashamed to disturb the cold air. Superstition bubbles up. A farmer buries coins at the edge of his field. A mother ties garlic to her child's wrist. Everyone is looking for control, for order in a world that has lost its structure. Then come the diseases. Nothing with a name, not yet, but strange fevers, lingering coughs, skin that bruises too easily. Your immune system, already weakened from lack of food and sun, begins to falter. And once the sickness starts, it spreads fast. Too many people, too little strength. The fog hasn't left. The sky is still dim, and your turnips are wilting. This is no longer survival. This is waiting. Waiting to see if the world remembers how to work. Waiting to see if the sun comes back. Waiting to see who will make it through. And above you, the clouds remain still. Not like a sky watching over its people, but like a lid pressing down on a pot that's starting to boil. There comes a point when people stop asking, when will this end? and start asking, is this how it is now? That's when you know the disaster has turned permanent. When the mind stops thinking in weeks or even months and starts adapting to a world without rules. That's what year 536 did. It erased the calendar. Spring arrived without flowers, summer came with frost, autumn brought no harvest, and winter refused to leave. You stopped marking feast days and began counting warm days like they were gold. You couldn't trust your instincts anymore. Planting seasons meant nothing. You put seeds in the ground on faith alone, watching the sky for any sign that the earth remembered how to live. But it didn't, and neither did the people. In Constantinople, traders argue over sacks of grain like they're relics. Ships return from Egypt empty. The Nile, once predictable, is low. Crop failure in the breadbasket of the empire means famine in the capital. Even nobles begin to notice the taste of thin broth. Prices double, then triple. Gold loses meaning. Bread becomes a currency. In Ireland, monks record the chilling phrase, a failure of bread for multiple years. That poetic line hides what it really means. Mass starvation, parents skipping meals, entire villages dissolving. Bread is not just food, it is life, and life is disappearing. In China, snowfall blankets fields in summer. Rice farmers kneel before their emperor, begging for mercy, as if he controls the clouds. In Korea, frost bites during festival days. The heavens remain unresponsive. Yellow dust rains from above. No one knows if it's ash or magic or divine wrath. They just know it's wrong. And in your village, all the rituals fail. You've lit candles. You've sacrificed lambs. You've prayed in Latin and whispered in old tongues to older gods. None of it matters. The weather no longer obeys prayers. Children no longer ask why. They grow up not knowing what seasons are supposed to feel like. They think all skies are gray. All winters are eternal. Their games are different now, quieter, more careful. You hear one child ask another, "Do you remember blue?" The fog is still here, that dry, dead mist that covers everything but explains nothing. It has become a second atmosphere, a veil over your life. Sunlight filters through it like guilt. You squint during the brightest part of the day, but still feel the chill. You begin to dream in gray. You forget what colors look like. And when you close your eyes, you imagine fire, not for light or cooking, but just to see something warm. This is what the loss of seasons does. It unravels the rhythms of life. It unthreads culture, rituals, and memory. What was once a cycle of planting, harvesting, feasting, resting, is now a straight line, one that leads nowhere. The world hasn't ended, it has stalled. Centuries later, long after the fog had lifted and the sun returned with cautious rays, scientists would ask, what on earth happened in the year 536? What could mute the sky, freeze the crops, and starve entire continents? The answer was buried, not in books or temples, but in ice. Thick cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica tell the story. Thin layers of ash, spikes in sulfur, evidence of a volcanic tantrum so massive, so widespread, that it shaded the planet. Somewhere, far from your village, a mountain had erupted, not with noise, but with fallout. But in your world, no one knew what a volcano even was. You'd never heard the term climate event. You couldn't imagine an eruption across the sea affecting your barley field. There were no maps, no weather charts, just the immediate and the incomprehensible. A dark sky, a dying field, a child with a cough that wouldn't quit. Historians now believe it was Iceland, or maybe North America, possibly even Indonesia. That's how widespread the mystery was. 1, 2, maybe 3 colossal volcanic eruptions in quick succession, each one hurling ash and sulfate aerosols high into the stratosphere, where they blanketed the globe. Think of it as the planet hitting the dimmer switch and then walking away. These particles didn't fall like rain. They floated high above the clouds, reflecting sunlight, cooling the earth, and turning every season into a haunted echo of winter. The eruption may have lasted days. The effects lingered for years. You didn't see fire. You saw the result. Your neighbor's fields failed. Your priest grew quieter in his sermons. Your own breath clouded the air in June, and far away, in palaces and courts, emperors and kings stared at the same dim sky, just as confused, just as powerless. Volcanoes had no names back then, no legends, no warnings, just aftermath. And this one came with gifts: famine, frost, and eventually plague. The fog, the cold, the hunger, all were symptoms. The cause, a blast of ash that none of you heard, a mountain that roared while the rest of the world shivered in silence. This is the cruelty of natural disaster in a pre-scientific age. There are no experts, no explanations, only fear, speculation, and slowly tightening belts. And even today, knowing what we know, that the earth erupted, that the sky responded, that temperatures fell, none of that changes how it felt to live through it. To you, it wasn't science, it was doom, the kind that crept in through your roof and curled around your cooking pot, leaving everything colder, and it still wasn't done. You can feel it in your fingers. That ache, that numbness. Cold is supposed to come and go, a part of life in your village. But now, it clings to you. It's not just air, it's in the walls, in the blankets, in the breath that turns to frost even inside your home. This cold isn't winter, it's something older, hungrier. The elders talk about the harsh seasons from their youth, the bitter storms, the snowdrifts, but even they fall silent when this new chill arrives, because this isn't a normal cold spell. It arrives in spring, it stays in summer, and it deepens in fall. By winter, it's just showing off. You light more fires, you gather more wood, but the heat disappears into the fog. Your hands stay raw, your bones feel heavier, your joints ache, and there's nothing left in the herbalist's cabinet to help. In the forests, the trees don't grow like they used to. The rings, centuries later, will show the truth: thin, stunted, reluctant growth. Even nature is shrinking. In Scandinavia, where the forests used to thrive, tree rings reveal something worse: collapse. Entire groves stop growing. The woods go still. The soil goes quiet. For a region used to long winters, this was different. It wasn't a season, it was an erasure. And in the towns, the markets begin to vanish. No fresh goods, no trade, no wagons filled with apples or salted meat. Even the smell of bread disappears. You walk through the village square, and it feels like walking through memory, a place that remembers abundance, but can no longer produce it. You notice fewer chickens, fewer dogs barking. The livestock pens sit eerily empty. Cows are thin. Goats are restless. Some animals stop reproducing altogether. Others are simply gone. People stop asking what happened to them. In China, they call it the summer frost. In Europe, they just call it the worst. In the Holy Roman territories, chroniclers write about silence. Towns that emptied without explanation. Villages that vanished. And when the sun does appear, Rarely, faintly, people pause to look up, as if they're seeing an old friend who owes them an apology. But it's fleeting. The light is thin, the warmth is gone, and soon the clouds reclaim the sky. The hardest part is not knowing what to do. You can't fight cold. You can't plead with it. You can only endure, and every day you do, it feels more like surviving than living. This is not a frost. This is a season without end, and still, something worse is coming. Because where cold walks, plague follows. Just when the world felt like it couldn't grow any dimmer, quieter, colder, a new presence crept in. It didn't shout, it didn't roar, it whispered, crawled, and bloomed behind closed doors. It moved through the shadows, and then it started taking names. They didn't call it plague yet. There was no word for it. Just a sickness that looked different than the rest. It didn't come with a chill or a cough. It came with swelling, with fevers that made men delirious, with people who collapsed in the street and never stood again. In the Byzantine Empire, it hit hardest. Constantinople, grand, glittering, overflowing with gold and ambition, became its theater. Ships brought grain to feed the city, but with the grain came stowaways, rats, and with the rats came fleas, and with the fleas came a disaster hidden in something so small no one could see it coming. Yersinia pestis, we call it now. But back then, it was just fear. It started in the port. Dock workers sickened first, then the baker, then the priest. Soon, entire blocks were quiet. Bells rang not for worship, but for funerals. Mass graves opened on the outskirts of the city. The scent of decay hung in alleyways. People stopped gathering, stopped working, stopped hoping. Even Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. For days, the empire teetered. If he died, there would be no plan. But he lived, barely, and returned not as a savior, but as a haunted shadow of the man he was before. His empire would never be the same. Elsewhere, the sickness followed the cold. In towns already weak from hunger, the plague moved swiftly. No resistance, no escape. In homes where famine had stolen strength, the disease finished what winter had begun. And in your village, word spread slowly. Travelers bring rumors. There's a sickness in the south, someone says. Half a city gone, says another. You don't want to believe them, but then the priest stops showing up, and a neighbor's door stays closed for 3 days. Someone finds them. Too late, the cemetery begins to grow. You start avoiding people. You cover your mouth, though you don't know why. You burn herbs. You hang charms over your door. Anything to keep the sickness at bay. But deep down, you know, it doesn't matter. It moves where it wants. It takes who it wants. There is no pattern, no mercy. The sky is still dim. The frost still bites. It is, in every sense, the perfect storm. The sun has vanished. The crops have failed. And now the breath you draw might be your last. By now, grief has become a routine. The bell that once marked the call to worship now tolls too often, too flatly, too late. You don't ask who it's for anymore. It could be your neighbor, your cousin, the boy who ran errands in the village square. You just bow your head, whisper a prayer, and return to the silence. There are no long funerals now, no processions, no proper rites. The dead outnumber the living, and the priests are too tired to say more than a few words. Sometimes the dead are buried in haste. Sometimes they're not buried at all. And when the frost creeps in again, the earth becomes too hard to dig. They say the plague doesn't care who you are. Rich, poor, pious, sinful, It moves through homes like smoke. The lucky die quickly. The unlucky linger, eyes glassy, breath rattling, surrounded by the already grieving. You begin to measure your fortune by how many in your home are still standing. In Constantinople, the plague rages so fiercely that carts drag bodies out by the dozen. Entire streets are deserted. Food rots in abandoned stalls. The city, once a living thing, pulses only with fear. The emperor recovers, but the empire falters. Further west, in Italy and Gaul, fields lie empty, not because of poor crops, but because there's no one left to farm them. Roads grow quiet, markets close. Dogs roam the streets without owners. People begin to speak of ghosts. And you start to see things. Whether from hunger, fever, or sheer exhaustion, visions come. A flicker in the corner of your eye. A shadow where none should be. Perhaps it's grief. Perhaps it's something else. But you don't ask. No one wants to know what walks with the fog. The seasons blur further. Was that summer? Was this winter? Does it even matter? Your clothes hang looser now. You haven't eaten well in weeks. The last loaf of bread was mostly made of bark and crushed oats. You chewed it anyway. The hunger dulls everything. The pain, the fear, the memories. It leaves only fatigue. Even weeping takes too much energy. A few families try to leave. They pack carts, carry infants, and march toward rumors of warmer lands, brighter skies, safer places. Most don't return. No one knows if they found peace or simply vanished into the gray. And through it all, the sun still fails to shine. A disk behind smoke, a light bulb without power. You wonder if it's hiding or watching. One evening, a child looks up and asks you the question everyone is afraid to voice. Is the world ending? You don't answer, because maybe it already has. Across the Byzantine Empire, the scale of devastation begins to overwhelm not just the people, but the very machinery of government. What had once been a symbol of Roman resilience, roads, aqueducts, trade routes, starts to crumble under the weight of absence. Bureaucrats fall ill and die in their chambers. Messengers stop arriving, and military posts go unmanned. Orders from Constantinople echo into silence. Emperor Justinian, once the architect of grand reforms and great conquests, survives the plague, but he is no longer the same man. Weakened in both body and spirit, he watches his empire stagger beneath the triple weight of famine, frost, and pestilence. His dream of restoring Rome's glory dims alongside the pale sky. The colossal legal codex he once commissioned, the Hagia Sophia he built to reach toward heaven, none of it seems to matter now that the heavens have turned their face away. Throughout the provinces, people lose faith, not just in God, but in kings, priests, and the very notion of order. The old rhythms of life have broken. Plagues move faster than news. One village might be untouched, while another, just miles away, is already burned out and buried. The fear is no longer about what's coming. It's about not knowing whether you're already too late. In cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and Ravenna, the once bustling centers of commerce now echo with emptiness. Entire quarters are abandoned. Markets dissolve into weed-choked courtyards. Cats and rats rule the alleyways. Survivors move through them like ghosts, silent, cautious, and suspicious of any stranger who dares appear. Meanwhile, monasteries fill with the sick. Priests who once gave sermons now administer last rites by the dozens. Their voices grow hoarse. Some lose their faith. Others cling to it harder, insisting that only greater repentance can turn the sun back on. But repentance is hard to find when the weak outnumber the strong and the living envy the dead. Elsewhere, across the countryside, small villages try to seal themselves off. They bar their gates, refuse travelers, and isolate the sick in barns. But the disease finds a way in, on hands, on cloth, in the breath of someone who didn't know they were already carrying it. Once it arrives, it spreads quickly, unstoppably, like a wind that only moves in one direction. As the death toll rises, society begins to fracture. Coins lose their value. Crops are hoarded. People stop burying their dead with ceremony. Trust erodes. Hunger sharpens tempers. A loaf of bread can ignite violence. A whispered rumor can empty a village overnight. Even nature seems uncertain. Birds don't return in spring. Wolves come closer to human settlements. Rivers flood without warning. The stars, when visible, look unfamiliar in the changed sky. For those still alive, each day feels less like part of a story and more like a slow unraveling of everything they once believed. This is no longer a temporary crisis. It is the new world, and no one knows what it will become. In a world where time no longer follows the rules and death has become a daily presence, people begin to act differently. The routines that once anchored life, morning prayers, market days, seasonal festivals, lose meaning. The rhythm of survival replaces the calendar. People no longer wake with plans. They wake simply hoping the day won't end in a grave. The traditional structures of society, the church, the nobility, the local councils, strain under the weight of unrelenting crisis. With fewer priests, churches become silent stone shells. With fewer officials, laws become suggestions rather than rules. Those with power grow increasingly detached from those without. The aristocracy barricades itself behind estate walls, hoarding grain and salt, trusting in steel gates rather than God. Their absence from the crumbling towns they once governed creates a vacuum no one is strong enough to fill. Across villages, survival turns inward. Family units become everything. Outsiders, once welcomed with warmth or curiosity, are now viewed with fear. A traveler is no longer a source of news, but a possible source of death. Hospitality vanishes. Doors close. Windows stay shuttered. Even kindness is rationed. Small communities revert to what they can control. Fields are dug up, not to grow crops, but to scavenge for roots. Herbs once used for healing are ground into bitter pastes, consumed more out of desperation than belief. People boil tree bark, chew leather, stretch flour with dust. A sheep's bone becomes the foundation for an entire meal. Hope lies not in abundance, but in endurance. Stories shift to where once there were tales of saints and miracles, now there are rumors. Some speak of lands where the sun still shines, where the frost has receded, where no one has died in weeks. Others whisper of divine punishment, of sins so great they have darkened the sky. A few claim the world has already ended, and what remains is merely the waiting room between life and judgment. Faith, once a pillar, becomes both refuge and weapon. Some seek peace in prayer, convinced that penance can lift the fog. Others blame their neighbors for inviting punishment with greed or heresy. Witchcraft, demons, omens, these explanations flourish in the absence of science. People search for patterns, signs, reasons, anything to make sense of a reality that has stopped making sense. In the monasteries that still function, the monks continue to write. Their hands, cold and stiff, scratch records into parchment. They don't know it yet, but they're preserving a history that future scholars will pore over for centuries. To them, it is not documentation, it is testimony. Meanwhile, children grow up without memory of how the world used to be. They learn to walk beneath a gray sky, to eat sparingly, to expect little. Their lullabies speak not of stars, but of frost. Their games involve hiding from the sick, not catching butterflies. They are becoming the first generation of a new era, one shaped not by ambition or conquest, but by quiet, grinding endurance. And outside their window, the sky remains unchanged. As the years slip by, the world slowly forgets what it once was. The fog becomes less of an intruder and more of a permanent resident. People no longer speak of the sun as something missing. They speak of it as something from stories, a golden warmth their grandparents claimed to remember. Most stop believing it will return. Children born during this time have no memory of bright skies or full harvests. Their eyes are used to dim light and cold mornings. They are taught to expect scarcity, not abundance. To them, the idea of overflowing markets or seasonal fruits sounds more like fantasy than history. Their world is one of smoke-colored days and frostbitten nights. They are shaped by hardship, molded not by guidance, but by the quiet disappearance of everything familiar. The collapse of memory spreads beyond the children. Adults begin to lose track of how long it's been since the sun faded. Was it 2 years? 3 more? There is no consensus. Records are fragmented. Oral traditions, once rich with songs and lineage, begin to fray. Elders pass without passing down their knowledge. Entire libraries are left to dust, their keepers gone or too weak to care. Trade routes wither. Where merchants once carried goods and stories between cultures, now there is only silence. Roads fall into disrepair, bridges collapse, and travel becomes dangerous not because of bandits, but because no one knows what's still out there. Cities shrink, not through war, but through attrition. A generation of people vanish from the map simply because there was no one left to mark their passing. Language begins to shift. Without institutions to enforce it, dialects splinter. Words change meaning. Some are lost altogether. Rituals become abbreviated, then forgotten. A once shared worldview fragments into thousands of local superstitions and regional myths. Isolation isn't just physical, it's cultural. And through it all, the land itself seems to change. Forests begin to reclaim once cleared farmland. Ivy crawls up abandoned stone. Towns rot at the edges. In some places, nature quietly erases the outlines of civilization. Travelers stumble upon empty hamlets, tools still resting where hands once held them, fireplaces cold, tables set, as if people vanished mid-thought. In the Byzantine world, tax records dwindle. Census takers disappear. The imperial apparatus loses track of its own borders. Even the mighty church begins to lose its grip. Bishops pass without replacement. Monasteries shudder. Faith persists, but its stewards dwindle. And all the while, no one knows what year it is anymore. The earth turns, the sky stays gray. People grow old without answers. And the future, it isn't planned, it's endured. No one builds anymore. They only bury. Eventually, change doesn't arrive with a bang. but with a breeze. One morning, a villager steps outside and notices something strange. The cold doesn't bite as sharply. The frost on the ground looks thinner. A bird sings faintly from a branch that had been silent for months. It's not a return to warmth, not yet, but it's different, and in a world locked in sameness, any difference feels profound. Over the following days, more small signs emerge. Streams flow faster. Buds form hesitantly on low branches. The snow, which had once seemed eternal, begins to retreat. It happens slowly, then more steadily, and eventually unmistakably. The world is warming. The fog thins in patches. Not gone, but no longer invincible. And then, one evening, someone sees the sun, not as a pale disk behind haze, but as a faint golden edge on the horizon. It doesn't last long, and its heat is barely felt, but it's there. For the first time in years, people gather outside and lift their faces skyward, not for prayer, but for light. No one cheers, no one sings. They simply stand in silence, tears running down cheeks, unsure if they're witnessing a miracle or a hallucination. The change is not immediate. The climate does not snap back to its old ways, but the rhythm begins to shift. Winters become slightly shorter. Summers, while still pale and cool, return with recognizable features: drier soil, longer days, flowering trees. Crops begin to sprout again, slowly, cautiously. Farmers return to the fields with hope stitched into every seed. With food comes energy. With energy comes conversation. People begin to travel again, first between nearby towns, then across valleys and ridges. Stories return to the roads. So do goods. Trade awakens. It limps at first, but the caravans begin to move again, carrying grain, wine, spices, and rumors. In Constantinople, the streets no longer echo with silence. Merchants dust off their stalls. The churches reopen. Bells ring with new purpose. The emperor, now aged and scarred by years of crisis, reasserts his rule, not as a restorer of glory, but as a survivor. His laws still exist, his vision remains. But it is clear now, the world he governs is not the same one he once dreamed of conquering. In the West, cities that had shrunk to husks begin to breathe again. Ravenna rebuilds, Rome regathers, rural communities reconnect. And throughout the world, the idea of rebuilding takes root. It is not triumph, it is not victory. It is the slow, aching resurrection of a planet that forgot how to grow. And in the evenings, when the sun lingers just a little longer than it used to, families gather outside, faces turned toward the fading warmth, sharing bread that once seemed impossible to bake. They don't speak of the fog anymore. They speak of what comes next. The world that emerges from the long shadow of 536 is not the same world that entered it. Its geography may look familiar, but its people are changed. Entire generations have been shaped by hunger, by silence, by loss. Communities that once looked outward with ambition now look inward with caution. Traditions have shifted. Beliefs have hardened or splintered. And everywhere, beneath the return of sunlight, lies a thin layer of ash, not on the ground, but in memory. The survivors are not the same as their ancestors. They remember how quickly everything can vanish. Their stories are stitched together from fragments, tales of the endless winter, of a sky that would not change, of neighbors who vanished in the night. They speak these stories softly, like prayers or warnings, careful not to disturb the thin thread of normalcy that has returned. In the Byzantine Empire, the economy struggles to rebuild. Coinage has been debased. Bureaucrats try to pick up where records left off, but too much was lost. Populations are reduced by half or more. The great cities are half empty, haunted by the memories of markets and temples now quiet. And while trade resumes, it does so with caution. Every merchant knows how fragile the system is. Every scribe knows how easily ink can fade when no one is left to read. In the West, kingdoms begin to rise where once there were provinces. The structure of Rome, already cracked before the catastrophe, now collapses into fragments. Out of these fragments, new powers grow. The Franks, the Visigoths, the Lombards, their leaders, seize opportunity from the vacuum. The age of emperors yields to the age of kings. The dream of uniting Europe under one rule dies quietly beneath the long shadow of the 6th century. Religion, too, transforms. Christianity had been a unifying force, but now, with weakened institutions and scattered authority, local variations begin to grow. Monasteries become more than religious centers. They are vaults of knowledge, clinics, granaries, and schools. Some monks now believe they survived because of divine favor. Others believe the apocalypse already came and passed. Either way, the church grows more powerful in rural areas, filling the gaps left by vanished nobles and broken governments. And in villages, everyday people carry on with a blend of hope and hesitation. Families teach their children to expect less and value what they have. People become more self-sufficient, more skeptical, more bound to the land. Survival is no longer seen as a given. It is an accomplishment. Across Asia, the effects have been just as profound. The summer snows in China leave behind a trail of failed dynastic reforms. Political instability gives way to unrest as famines test the authority of emperors. The rhythms of rice farming are rewritten. In India, rainfall patterns shift, and kingdoms in the Deccan Plateau must adjust to new agricultural realities. Even distant civilizations feel the tremors of this forgotten climate catastrophe. All of this change, all of this upheaval, traces back to that silent explosion in the sky, to a volcanic burst that no one saw, that everyone suffered. A moment in geological time that lasted a few hours and reshaped human history for decades. Long after the skies had cleared and the frost receded, the trauma of the 530s lingered in the bones of civilization. It wasn't just the scars on the land or the villages that never repopulated. It was the way people spoke, the things they no longer dreamed of, the quiet caution that seeped into every ritual, every decision. Even as the world began to warm again, the memory of when it didn't hung over every harvest. For historians, centuries later, this period would seem almost mythical in its devastation. What Justinian had hoped would be a reconquest of the West dissolved in the aftermath. The funds dried up, the armies thinned. Infrastructure decayed faster than it could be repaired. The old imperial roads, arteries of connection, turned into cracked paths traveled only by the desperate. The Western world drifted further from classical antiquity. Cities shrank, education stalled, the arts grew quiet. Without parchment, teachers, or stability, literacy declined. Philosophy gave way to superstition, and where once people sculpted gods in marble, they now carved crude icons in wood, hoping for protection. But even in this slow decline, seeds of resilience took root. They preserved Plato and Cicero, not because they understood them, but because someone told them they were worth saving. In remote alpine valleys, villagers passed down herbal knowledge, weather lore, and stories of the long winter. In Syria and Egypt, small communities of scholars and mystics continued to debate theology, unaware that they were becoming the last links to an earlier age of learning. The memory of 536 faded slowly, distorted by time. How the air turned bitter in midsummer, how cities emptied and kings fell ill. Some described it as divine punishment, others as a curse, and some tried not to speak of it at all. Yet its impact remained. The world had been knocked off balance, and though it began to recover, it did so in a different shape. The old ways no longer fit. New structures were born out of necessity. New hierarchies emerged not from conquest, but from survival. Trade networks reformed along different paths. New languages began to evolve, shaped by isolation and adaptation. Even food changed. What people planted, how they cooked, what they feared running out of. Across Europe and Asia, agriculture shifted. Resilience became the most valued trait in both crops and people. Perhaps most lasting of all was the lesson that the earth itself could turn against you. Without war, without invasion, without any enemy to fight, a single moment in nature, a burst of rock, a plume of ash, could bend the arc of history, and no one saw it coming. Even centuries after the event, legends spoke of the year when the sky lost its color. In some places, they said the sun turned to blood. In others, it was said to have vanished completely, leaving only a dim eye that watched the world suffer. Stories passed down through generations, exaggerated, romanticized, and distorted what happened. But at the core of those tales was a truth. The climate once betrayed humanity. Later scientific inquiry would uncover what the people of 536 could not have known. Ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica tell the same story. Massive spikes in sulfuric acid residues, proof of a stratospheric eruption. Tree rings from across the northern hemisphere show a sharp halt in growth. Crops failed, not because of poor farming or war, but because photosynthesis itself was strangled by atmospheric dust. And this wasn't a single event. Researchers now believe that 536 was only the beginning. Another volcanic eruption followed in 540, then yet another in 547. These back-to-back environmental shocks created what climatologists call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a multi-decade period of lower temperatures, shortened growing seasons, and ecological instability. For those alive at the time, it must have felt like the world had been permanently rewritten. But the tragedy wasn't just in the temperature, it was in the timing. Human societies in the 6th century were interconnected in fragile ways. Empires stretched themselves thin, dependent on long trade routes and complex bureaucracies. Populations were dense in cities, reliant on stored grain and imported food. When the climate changed, the systems that supported those societies collapsed in sequence. In the East, the Byzantine Empire weathered the storm, but only just. Its recovery was slow, and its borders permanently altered. In the West, the Merovingians in Gaul and the Ostrogoths in Italy saw their influence diminish. In Britain, the already weakened Romano-British culture fragmented further, paving the way for the rise of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In the Americas, archaeological evidence suggests similar patterns. Some Andean societies contracted or migrated during the same period. In China, dynastic struggles intensified amid famines and internal rebellions. The global reach of the catastrophe is clearer now than it ever could have been to those living through it. What they experienced as divine wrath, historians and scientists now understand as a series of natural events converging into a single, sustained disaster. But even this modern understanding doesn't erase the pain. Knowledge doesn't dull the cold or quiet the hunger. All it does is shine a light on how narrow the margin of survival really was. The survivors didn't rebuild in the image of the old world. They built something new, shaped by the memory of a time when the sky turned strange, the earth hardened, and the warmth they took for granted vanished. It was not just a year that changed history. It was a year that reminded humanity how powerless it could be. In time, what was once real became folklore. Stories of the long dark began to take on new shapes. In some places, they spoke of an eternal winter brought on by angry gods. In others, they told of a serpent that swallowed the sun. Children heard tales of a cursed year when the crops turned to ash and voices carried only whispers. Across cultures, the memories of 536 and the years that followed were folded into myths, not because people wanted to forget, but because they needed a way to make sense of the senseless. In Scandinavia, echoes of this period may have inspired legends of Fimbulvidr, the great winter that precedes Ragnarok. In Irish chronicles, the annals describe a failure of bread and a great mortality. Byzantine historians like Procopius noted that the sun gave forth light without brightness. Chinese records mention frost in summer and famine across the empire. Even Mesoamerican and Andean oral traditions speak of a time when the sun turned away. What began as witness accounts slowly morphed into allegory. The people who had lived through those dark years didn't have access to seismographs or satellite images. They didn't know about volcanic aerosols or jet streams, but they knew something had gone deeply wrong with the world, and they passed that knowledge on the only way they could, through story. These tales weren't always accurate. They weren't meant to be. They were survival mechanisms. They encoded the trauma of a generation into symbols that could be passed down. A father who couldn't feed his children didn't tell them the sun was blocked by sulfur particles. He told them the sky was sick, that the gods were angry, that someday it would return to balance if they lived rightly. This way, the trauma became part of cultural DNA, even centuries later. Long after the scientific understanding of volcanic eruptions and climate disruption, those legends persist. Scholars trace them like breadcrumbs through ancient texts, cave carvings, epic poems, and seasonal rites. They are everywhere once you know how to look, not because the world ended in 536, but because, for a while, it nearly did. And those who endured it didn't just leave behind ruins and records. They left behind warnings, not carved into stone or pressed into gold, but whispered in bedtime stories, etched in myths, folded into fables that still carry the weight of real fear. Because even if we've forgotten the name of the volcano or the pattern of the ash cloud, we remember what it feels like to lose the sky. Modern science, centuries removed from the suffering of 536, finally pieced together the clues left behind in ice, soil, and tree rings. What history remembered as a mysterious darkness and global collapse, geology revealed to be the aftermath of a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, or possibly more than one. The most likely culprit, a massive volcanic event in the tropics, possibly in Central America, Southeast Asia, or even Iceland. The true origin remains debated, but its effects are undeniable. Volcanic eruptions of this magnitude eject immense quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. There, the gas mixes with water to form a haze of sulfuric acid droplets that scatter sunlight and cool the Earth's surface. In 536, that veil dimmed the skies of the entire northern hemisphere. Summer temperatures dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius, a shift that might seem small, but on a global scale, it's a climatic sledgehammer. The drop in temperature shortened growing seasons and brought frost to places that should have been warm. The famine wasn't caused by a single failed harvest, but by several consecutive years of agricultural collapse. With weakened immunity from starvation, populations became easy prey for disease. The plague that followed, devastating Constantinople and beyond, thrived in these conditions. The volcanic winter didn't just kill crops, it killed the resistance that kept plagues at bay. And it didn't stop there. A second major eruption followed in 540, amplifying the crisis. A third, smaller eruption may have struck in 547. This sequence of events created what scientists now refer to as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a cooling trend that lasted into the 600s. The Earth itself was not just responding to one disaster, but to a chain reaction. The skies dimmed, temperatures dropped, and civilizations struggled to adapt to a planet that seemed to have changed its rules overnight. The effects of the eruption touched every corner of the known world. In Europe, political instability became endemic. In China, dynasties faltered amid crop failure. In the Americas, shifting rainfall patterns changed the fortunes of ancient cities. In Arabia, climate change may have played a role in reshaping trade routes, setting the stage for new religious and political movements. Far from being a localized disaster, the events of 536 were global in scope, subtle in mechanism, and profound in consequence. What makes it even more haunting is that it happened quietly. There was no single date to mark the eruption, no one to blame, no city reduced to ash like Pompeii. The volcano that triggered it left no famous ruins, no charred bodies preserved in stone. Its legacy was slower, colder, harder to see, but far more destructive. And perhaps that's why it still echoes. Because the worst year in human history didn't look like fire. It looked like silence. It looked like frost. It looked like forgetting. When the skies cleared, it wasn't celebration that followed. It was work, slow, backbreaking, deeply uncertain. People emerged from years of hunger, plague, and fear into a world that was familiar in name but unrecognizable in practice. The fields were overgrown, towns were half empty, entire crafts had vanished, guilds were gone, lineages broken. A generation had been raised with no memory of how things were before the dark. But humans, fragile as they are, have one gift that endures: adaptation. They began to rebuild not by resurrecting the old world, but by constructing a new one shaped by caution, memory, and the need to never again be caught so unprepared. Farming techniques shifted. People planted hardier crops, diversified food sources, and became deeply local. The idea of relying too heavily on one harvest or one route of supply had proven deadly. Adaptation became a necessity, not a virtue. Architecture changed too. In some regions, homes were built more defensively. Villages grew closer together. Granaries became central structures, protected like churches. In others, people sought the shelter of highlands or river valleys, places less exposed to extreme shifts in weather. And all the while, faith and fear mingled in new ways. Religion, which had once been about cosmic order and divine majesty, became more intimate, more immediate. Saints multiplied. Relics became precious. Miracles were sought not for grandeur, but for survival, to cure the sick, to bless a field, to bring rain. The spiritual became personal. Clerics and monks, many of whom had survived and served during the crisis, held new authority, not just as spiritual guides, but as community leaders and knowledge keepers. Politically, the balance of power shifted. The Byzantine Empire, though battered, retained its identity. But the western remnants of Rome fractured permanently. Local rulers, warlords, and tribal leaders became kings. The vacuum left by imperial retreat was filled by feudalism's slow, creeping rise. Power now came from the control of land, not law. Castles replaced courts. Oaths replaced constitutions. In the East, the calamities of the 6th century would eventually be followed by the explosive rise of Islam in the 7th, a transformation that would reshape Asia, Africa, and Europe alike. Some historians suggest that the instability caused by the volcanic cooling and plague had helped fracture old systems, creating conditions where new faiths and ideas could take root rapidly. Even the idea of history changed. For many who lived through the fog years, time had become fluid. The calendar no longer mattered as much as the seasons, and when the seasons failed, people marked their lives by what they lost. The year my brother died. The winter when the sun stayed hidden. The spring when the wheat finally returned. And yet, life went on. Babies were born. Bread was baked. Music returned to festivals. Laughter, timid, cautious, found its way back into village evenings. After years of relentless darkness, even the smallest normality felt like a miracle. It wasn't the same world, but it was still home. As the generations passed, the terror of 536 and the years that followed slipped slowly into obscurity. Not because they weren't significant, but because memory, especially collective memory, is fragile. Without books, without continuity, and with entire communities erased, much of what had been experienced firsthand was left to fade. In the centuries that followed, people remembered the events of the mid-6th century in pieces, a vague tale of a year without a summer, a saint's biography describing cities abandoned and skies darkened, a church hymn referencing pestilence and endless night. These weren't detailed records, they were fragments, clues, echoes of catastrophe. By the time medieval chroniclers tried to make sense of their past, they had only scattered accounts to work with. Some historians noted plagues or climate oddities, but lacked the tools to connect them to geological forces. Others dismissed the period as a time of sin and divine punishment, weaving spiritual explanations around very real environmental shifts. What they lacked in science, however, they compensated for with moral clarity. They believed that such suffering must have a cause. Whether it was vanity, war, or abandonment of faith, they saw the catastrophe as part of a moral narrative. Nature was not just an actor, it was a mirror reflecting humanity's failures. Modern scholars, with access to satellite data, glacial cores, and advanced dating techniques, would eventually piece together a more complete picture. And with that picture came a realization. This was not just an ancient tragedy, but a case study in how civilization responds to compounded crises. The lessons were sobering. A single environmental event, powerful enough can overwhelm even the most advanced societies of its time. Political borders, cultural achievements, and economic systems mean little when crops fail 3 years in a row and the sky refuses to shine. Resilience depends not just on strength, but on flexibility, the ability to adapt, to preserve knowledge, to act collectively. But the most dangerous lesson of all is the one most often overlooked: forgetting. Because the Earth does not operate on human timelines. Another eruption could happen tomorrow, another dark summer, another chain of events that exposes just how delicate our global web truly is. We have satellites, yes, we have technology, but we are still flesh and fear, still dependent on soil, weather, and time. The world of 536 had no warning. Ours might not get one either. And so, the long-ago silence of that forgotten year should not be viewed as a distant relic of a primitive age. It should be seen as a whisper, a caution, a reminder that history, like the sun, can disappear for a while and leave us blinking in the dark. If the Earth has a voice, then volcanoes are its deepest, oldest language. When Mount Tambora erupted in 1815, over 1,000 years after 536, it blanketed the world in darkness again, triggering what came to be known as the year without a summer. Crops failed across Europe. New England saw snow in June. Famines swept Asia. The world, once again, was reminded of its fragility. But what happened in 1816 was better documented, better understood. Newspapers reported it, scientists investigated it, and still, even with that knowledge, the event left scars. Now imagine enduring a similar, or worse, event with no context, no understanding of atmospheric science, no global communication, no way to trace cause to effect. That was 536. The sky dimmed, the cold came, people died, and no one knew why. This is what makes the events of that year not just tragic, but terrifying, because there was no villain, no warlord to depose, no plague to quarantine, no flood to rebuild from. It was invisible, indifferent, the result of a shift deep within the earth that rippled outward into every home, every church, every field, and for years it never stopped. We like to believe that disasters come and go quickly, that they strike and then fade. But some, like 536, arrive silently and leave slowly, not with a bang, but with a shadow that stretches over decades. They change not just the world, but the people within it. They alter rhythms, traditions, and expectations. And when they finally do pass, what's left behind doesn't resemble what was lost. Many survivors of that century would go on to live through further plagues, wars, and famines. Some would rebuild cities. Others would die nameless in villages that no longer exist. But whether they were leaders or laborers, monks or merchants, they all carried the same invisible burden. They had lived in a time when the world no longer made sense. Their voices are gone, their names mostly forgotten. But in ruins unearthed, in manuscripts preserved, in tree rings and glacial ice, the whispers remain. Whispers of a sunless sky, of a people who endured the unendurable, of the year the world paused. Despite its obscurity in mainstream history books, the legacy of the year 536 is etched into the deep architecture of our modern world. It marked more than just a temporary setback. It redefined the trajectory of empires, the structure of economies, and even the nature of cultural memory. Its fingerprints are on the ruins of forgotten cities, the faded ink of hastily rewritten laws, and the fragments of collapsed dynasties. In Western Europe, the political vacuum left by Rome's collapse and worsened by climate chaos accelerated the shift from classical antiquity to the medieval world. What had been a region unified, however imperfectly, by Latin law and imperial identity, fractured into a mosaic of tribes, duchies, and feudal holdings. The central authority of the empire was replaced by local lords, who governed not by philosophy, but by land and loyalty. This was not merely a regression, it was a transformation. The crisis of 536 didn't destroy civilization, it rearranged it. The rise of monastic communities, the localizing of economies, the elevation of new religious powers. These were not accidents, they were responses, survival strategies. The world that came after was less centralized, but in many ways more adaptive. It had to be. The cultural memory of the disaster, though fading in exact detail, lingered in attitude. You can see it in the art of the time, the preference for humility over grandeur, for endurance over ambition. In Christian texts, the themes of suffering and redemption grow more pronounced. The apocalyptic tone of early medieval writing wasn't just theological, it was experiential. These were people who had watched the sky go dark and believed they had survived the end of days. And yet, life resumed, slowly, grudgingly, but it did. The world became more fragmented, yes, but also more diverse. Regional identities sharpened, local traditions deepened. And out of this fractured world would later emerge the seeds of Renaissance, Reformation, and Revolution. In the East, the Byzantine Empire adapted in its own way. Though Justinian's grand ambitions were curtailed, the empire survived and evolved. It became more defensive, more religious, more inward-looking, laying the groundwork for Byzantine culture that would endure for centuries. Even after the Western empires it once sought to reclaim were long gone. Elsewhere, the ripple effects were subtler, but no less real. Trade shifted. Languages evolved. Even architecture changed, favoring practicality and resilience. Agricultural calendars were revised. Religious festivals were reinterpreted to account for a world that had proven itself capable of sudden, devastating silence. The lesson wasn't just that nature could destroy, but that humanity could endure. And now, centuries later, in an era of satellites and sensors and global warnings, the story of 536 returns to us, not as a myth, but as a message. It says, even the most advanced civilizations can be humbled. But it also says, survival is not the end of the story. Rebuilding is. When we walk through modern cities, it's easy to believe in permanence. Towering buildings, stable governments, instant global communication. These are the signs of a civilization confident in its mastery of the world. But beneath our streets, in the layers of earth and time, lie the quiet reminders that everything we build stands on unstable ground. Archaeologists uncover these reminders in the soil. A blackened layer of ash buried beneath a Scandinavian settlement. A sudden abandonment of an Irish ring fort. Coins that vanish from the archaeological record for 2 decades. In isolation, these findings are curious. Together, they tell a story, a worldwide pause when time itself seemed to fracture. This global layer, faint but traceable, represents not just the physical fallout of 536's volcanic outburst, but the psychic rupture it caused in human history. It is the signature of a moment when Earth asserted itself, not with fiery destruction, but with chilling silence. And now, with tools undreamed of by 6th century monks or emperors, we can trace its path. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show spikes in sulfur consistent with massive volcanic events. Tree rings from Ireland, Siberia, and California all narrow in unison, a global cry of slowed growth. Even sediment layers in lakes and oceans reveal disruptions in biological activity. All this data converges on one conclusion: 536 was not a local tragedy, but a planetary event. And yet, for centuries, it was forgotten. Why? Because those who lived through it had no framework to record or interpret it beyond myth. Their writings, if they survived at all, were scattered and regional. Their losses were too vast and their resources too limited to preserve a consistent narrative. Their monuments crumbled before the ink had dried. But now, with science and global records, we are their scribes. We look back across time and speak for them, not just to honor their suffering, but to heed their warning. Because the forces that shaped their world still sleep beneath our feet. Volcanoes do not keep calendars. They do not send invitations. And when they wake again, as they surely will, we too may find ourselves in the path of ash and silence. What we choose to do with this knowledge, to prepare or to forget, will shape the stories our descendants tell of us. The year 536 was not the end of the world, but it was a reminder that the world has no obligation to remain as we expected, and the ashes beneath our feet are still warm. There is something haunting about a disaster that no one understands until centuries later. The people of 536 didn't know they were living through the worst year in recorded history. They had no weather maps, no global data, no scientific consensus. All they had was experience and fear. The skies dimmed, the crops died, the cold arrived, and no one could explain why. This lack of understanding made everything worse. Without cause, they blamed sin. Without explanation, they blamed enemies, heretics, witches, or foreign kings. Fear turned to suspicion. Suspicion turned to conflict. In a world suddenly hostile, people began to turn on one another as much as on the famine or plague. This wasn't just a climate crisis, it was a psychological one, a social one, and perhaps that is the most chilling legacy of 536. How easy it is to descend into chaos when the lights go out and the answers disappear. Because as modern as we think we are, as connected and scientific and informed, we are still vulnerable to the same blind spots. In a world of information overload, it's easy to assume that disasters will come with headlines, push notifications, or viral videos. But the next great catastrophe may arrive just as quietly as the last. And our response, our preparedness, our unity will determine how much we lose. The people of 536 didn't fail because they were primitive. They failed because they were isolated. And isolation, even today, remains one of our greatest threats. When we study the past, it's tempting to view it as a museum, a collection of curiosities and ruins. But the truth is, it's a manual, a warning label, a list of what broke last time and what we still haven't fixed. The year 536 reminds us that nature doesn't care about our timelines. It doesn't care about our empires, our stock markets, or our elections. It moves according to deeper rhythms, tectonic, volcanic, atmospheric, and when those rhythms turn, the impact is universal. But unlike the people of 536, we are not entirely helpless. We have tools, we have knowledge, we have the ability to watch the earth and listen for its early warnings. But what we often lack is will, the will to prepare, before the eruption, the will to learn before the darkness, the will to act before the silence sets in. Because once the sky goes gray and the frost comes in July, it may already be too late to start building answers. For all the pain and darkness that 536 ushered in, the centuries that followed were not static. Slowly, unevenly, life began to resume its familiar shape. Fields were cleared again. Families replanted their orchards. Markets returned, though smaller. Songs were rewritten to celebrate endurance, not glory. And children were raised not on tales of conquest, but of survival. But the recovery was not linear. Some regions bounced back quickly, especially those with robust river systems or dense forest resources. Others, mountain villages, isolated islands, arid plateaus, took generations to recover. Some never did. In places where entire communities vanished, forests grew over once cleared land. Ruins became foundations for new towns with new names. The past faded, swallowed by moss and time. What endured, more than the buildings, was the shift in mindset. The people who rebuilt did so with caution. They diversified crops. They stored more grain. They honored saints of healing and rain and light. Their prayers reflected lived memory. "Protect us from sky darkening," one fragment reads. Another, from a medieval liturgy, asks God to guard the sun in its course. These were not abstract hopes, they were specific fears. And with those fears came innovation. The early Middle Ages are often described as a cultural backslide, but this oversimplifies the story. What really happened was adaptation. In the vacuum left by fallen empires, people created new systems. Monasteries became hubs of knowledge, agriculture, and medicine. Local councils developed their own governance. Oral traditions flourished. While large-scale infrastructure projects halted, smaller, community-driven efforts filled the gaps. Architecture changed to thick stone walls, sloped roofs, and subterranean storage spaces reflected the lessons of a colder, hungrier time. Even food habits evolved. Porridge, stews, and fermented goods became staples, designed to stretch ingredients and preserve nutrients in harsh seasons. What's most remarkable is not that civilization survived, but that it found new ways to express itself. Despite everything, humans continued to write, to build, to sing. Poems were composed not about kings, but about weather, about endurance, about divine mercy. In Iceland, skaldic verses immortalized long winters. In Byzantium, mosaics glowed with scenes of paradise, perhaps as a refuge from earthly hardship. In China, scholars wrote reflections on heaven's silence during times of drought and frost. This wasn't just recovery, it was reinvention. The world that emerged from the shadow of 536 was more fragmented, more local, more spiritual, but also more resilient. It had learned the hard way how fragile abundance could be, and that knowledge, passed down through generations, would influence everything from city planning to seasonal rituals. So while the worst year may have left a scar, it also seeded a kind of wisdom, a quiet understanding that light does return. And when it does, it is to be cherished. The silence of 536 is not confined to the past. It resonates even now in the way we think about climate, crisis, and the fragility of our systems. As our technology accelerates and our cities stretch skyward, we often forget how close we still are to nature's whims. But scientists, historians, and climate experts haven't forgotten. In fact, they've placed 536 under a microscope, not just to understand what happened, but to prepare for what could. Modern volcanology has confirmed that eruptions of similar or even greater magnitude are not rare in geological time. They are simply infrequent on a human scale. Tambora in 1815, Krakatoa in 1883, Pinatubo in 1991, all reminded the world of how quickly the planet can rewrite its script. And when those eruptions happened, we saw echoes of 536, failed crops, displaced populations, dramatic sunsets, and global cooling. But in 536, there were no satellites, no relief agencies, no global food supply chains. Today, we have those tools, but we also have new vulnerabilities. We are more connected, but more dependent. A climate disruption on the scale of 536 today would ripple instantly across international markets, disrupt internet infrastructure, and push global health systems to their limits. We would understand what was happening, yes, but that wouldn't necessarily stop it. In many ways, we are still building the same kind of resilience our ancestors once did. Climate scientists model future volcanic winters. Food security experts plan for regional collapses. Geoengineering proposals have even been modeled on the stratospheric effects of volcanic eruptions, ironically inspired by the very events that once devastated the planet. There are even conversations in the scientific community about establishing a volcanic early warning system, an international framework for monitoring potential supereruptions. These efforts are serious because what happened in 536 isn't a cautionary tale. It's a real-world precedent, and the memory of that year is becoming more visible. Popular history books now feature it, documentaries reference it, podcasts explore it. Even school curriculums are beginning to acknowledge the profound role that natural disasters have played in shaping human history, not just through fire and water, but through absence, through light lost, through years of gray. 536 is no longer just a number in a dusty chronicle. It's a marker, a turning point, a reminder that progress and peace exist on borrowed time. Unless we understand the forces that shaped our past and will shape our future. Because the greatest danger is not that it could happen again. The greatest danger is that it could, and we'd still be surprised. For centuries, the story of 536 was buried, not only by ash and time, but by the limits of historical memory. It left no pyramids or war-torn chronicles. No defining moment captured in a painting or carved into a monument. Its greatest monument is silence, and that makes it one of the most elusive catastrophes in human history. But memory does not always need a voice. Sometimes it lives in patterns, in the rings of trees, the cores of glaciers, the sudden abandonment of a city, or a lull in recorded births across regions. In the 6th century, there was no global calendar. No one agreed on what year it was. And yet, all around the world, signs point to the same disruption. This is what modern historians call a global event horizon. A moment when the earth hiccuped, and everyone, whether in Ireland or India, felt it. Not all equally, but unmistakably. Yet, in the retelling, memory is shaped not by what happened, but by what we understand happened. And that's where myth fills the gaps. Legends of fire, serpents, of gods swallowing the sun, of endless winters and haunted skies, all emerged from the same raw human need to explain the inexplicable. These were not just tales. They were attempts to bind chaos with narrative, to make sense of the senseless. And we still do this today. When disasters strike, we look for meaning. We ask, why now? We blame systems, people, even fate. It's human nature to wrap suffering in story, to keep it from unraveling us. That instinct is what preserved the spirit of 536, even when the facts disappeared. What couldn't be archived in ink survived in folklore. What couldn't be proven was passed through ritual, whispered in prayer, etched into cultural fear. And now, as we recover those threads, we have a choice. We can see 536 as a relic, an oddity of ancient time. Or we can see it as a mirror. Because in the rhythm of history, events like 536 are not rare. They are inevitable. What varies is not their frequency, but our readiness. The people of the 6th century had no warning, but we do, and that changes everything if we choose to listen. The year 536 wasn't just a tragedy, it was a teacher, and its classroom was the world. Across continents, from the icy north to the dusty plains of Africa, from the bustling cities of the Byzantine Empire to the rice fields of China, people adapted. Some fell, some survived, but all were changed. The earth had shifted, and with it, the very idea of stability. Historians and scientists today don't look back at 536 simply to recount misery. They examine it to understand resilience, how societies fracture under pressure, and how they come back together in new forms. It's a map of human response to disaster, drawn not in ink, but in climate patterns, DNA shifts, and architectural remnants. One lesson stands out above the rest. Collapse is rarely sudden. Contrary to popular imagination, the events of 536 didn't knock the world off its axis overnight. The sun dimmed, yes, the crops failed. But what came next was a slow unraveling, a decade or more of tension, sickness, war, and transformation. And in that slow-motion collapse is the lesson we often miss. It's not always the eruption that destroys you, it's the echo. That echo can take many forms. It might be the second eruption in 540, compounding the climate trauma. It might be the spread of plague in weakened cities. It might be the breakdown of trade, the loss of faith in leaders, the cultural amnesia that follows hunger. Each echo chips away at what remains until the original cause is almost forgotten, but the consequences remain. In this, the past whispers a vital truth. Surviving the first shock is only the beginning. Recovery takes foresight, coordination, trust, and trust, once broken, especially in systems, leaders, and institutions, is harder to rebuild than stone walls or city gates. After 536, many places didn't rebuild to what they were. They became something else, more localized, more spiritual, more defensive. The great ambitions of empire shrank. The sacred became personal, and memory became survival. Modern researchers have found evidence of massive religious shifts during this time. Monasteries growing in number, new saints rising in popularity, and even changes in burial practices that suggest a population obsessed not with power, but with protection. These weren't just spiritual responses, they were social strategies for dealing with the unknowable. And perhaps we are not so different today. We seek meaning in change. We cling to systems of belief when the world feels unstable. And we tell stories, not just to pass the time, but to pass on the warnings. The story of 536 is not one of despair. It is one of persistence, a story written in layers of ice and ash, and beneath that, in the quiet determination of those who refused to let the sky's silence be the end. The irony of 536 is that while it is remembered as the worst year to be alive, it was also the beginning of something. Not something glorious or immediate, but a slow, persistent evolution of the human condition. From the ashes of collapse came the roots of renewal. Justinian's empire may have faltered, but out of its remnants came the codification of Roman law, laws that would influence Europe for centuries. Monasteries, born from the need for sanctuary and order during crisis, became the intellectual engines of the medieval world. They preserved books, taught literacy, cultivated crops, and created safe havens for the sick and poor. In the East, empires like the Temps would rise, bringing with them periods of prosperity and innovation. In the Arabian Peninsula, trade networks altered by climatic shifts helped shape the stage for a new religious movement that would sweep continents. Even in the far reaches of Scandinavia, oral traditions carried whispers of sunless skies and ice-locked seas, echoes that would feed into sagas and myth. In this way, the catastrophes of 536 didn't just end things, they reshaped the playing field. What had once seemed like isolated worlds began to connect through the shared experience of loss and adaptation. People learned, sometimes painfully, that resilience depended not just on strength, but on cooperation, on information, on memory. And yet, the real engine of recovery wasn't kings or councils, it was ordinary people. It was the farmers who replanted when they had no reason to hope, the parents who told bedtime stories under gray skies to keep wonder alive, the healers who passed down folk remedies when medicine failed, the scribes who kept writing even when they weren't sure anyone would read what they recorded. They didn't rebuild the same world, they built a new one. And that world, in time, would flourish. As modern societies, we are tempted to think of history as a series of upward steps. But 536 reminds us that progress is rarely linear. Sometimes it circles back, sometimes it stumbles, and sometimes it falls flat in the mud of a sunless summer. But it always moves, and in that motion lies our deepest strength. Because no matter how long the night lasts, the instinct to endure, to create, to connect, to rebuild remains. We are the descendants of those who survived 536. We carry their scars in our myths, their warnings in our science, their resilience in our blood. And if the sun were to vanish tomorrow, their story would remind us the light comes back, eventually. Today, if the sun dimmed and frost came in June, it would not go unnoticed. Weather satellites would sound the alarm. News reports would flood social media. Scientists would scramble to determine the cause. Governments would debate responses, and food prices would spike within hours. But would we be ready? That question looms large in discussions of historical climate disasters. Because while we now have the tools to observe and model global changes, we also have systems that are more interconnected, more interdependent, and, ironically, more brittle than ever before. In 536, a bad harvest meant starvation for a village. Today, a crop failure in one hemisphere can send shockwaves through supply chains on the other side of the planet. The lessons of 536 teach us that it's not just the magnitude of a disaster that matters, it's how prepared we are to endure its aftermath. Many climatologists and policy analysts now point to the 6th century catastrophe as a prototype for global stress events. These are not single calamities, but overlapping crises, environmental, economic, and social, that test the foundations of civilization. Much like what we saw in 2020 with the pandemic, modern society remains vulnerable not just to natural forces, but to the compounding effects of fear, misinformation, and systemic weakness. Yet the legacy of 536 also offers hope. It reminds us that after the sky goes dark, people do not simply vanish. They adapt, they innovate, they care for one another, and sometimes they create the conditions for an entirely new chapter in human history. Just as the collapse of older empires created space for new ones to rise, so too might future disruptions clear paths for more sustainable, cooperative societies, if we choose to walk them. There is a quiet dignity in how the people of the 6th century responded. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't have the science to explain it or the technology to reverse it, but they kept going. They preserved what they could. They mourned what they lost, and they laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. In our time, remembering their experience is not just a matter of curiosity, it's a matter of survival. Because volcanic winters will come again, climate shocks will return, and the question will not be whether they can be avoided, but whether we remembered enough of the past to face them with wisdom instead of panic. We have one advantage those before us did not. We know this story already. We're just deciding how to write the next chapter. The year 536 may be long gone, but its shadow stretches into the present and the future. It reminds us that nature doesn't operate on our schedules, that even the most stable societies are vulnerable to sudden disruption, and that survival often comes down to how well we remember the past. Because 536 wasn't just about darkness, it was about discovery. It was about what happens when the systems we trust, whether agriculture, leadership, even the sun itself, fail us. It showed the limits of our understanding, but also the depths of our resilience. And in that fragile balance between confusion and adaptation lies the enduring power of its story. The people of that century didn't leave behind flashy monuments or clear explanations, but they left clues in tree rings, in ruins, in manuscripts, in myths. Each fragment carries the echo of their reality, a reminder that what seems impossible today has already happened before, and it will happen again. Not the same way, not at the same time, but the earth will shift, the climate will change, crops will fail, and the question we will face is not whether we can stop it, but whether we can remember clearly, wisely, and fully enough to endure it together. So as you go about your day under a bright sky, consider this: somewhere beneath your feet, the earth sleeps restlessly. Somewhere beyond the clouds, forces churn that we cannot yet see. And somewhere in your own life, there are lessons waiting to be learned, not in fear, but in preparation. The year 536 may have been the worst year to be alive, but it was also a year that gave us one of the clearest messages history has ever whispered. You don't have to understand everything to survive it. You just have to keep going, keep growing, keep remembering, because history is not just the story of what broke. It's the story of what endured. And in that, we are all part of the same ancient legacy, watching the sky, listening for silence, and walking forward anyway. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the forgotten darkness of the past. If you found this exploration meaningful, consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes for more deep dives into history's most unexpected corners. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your skies clear, and your memory long.